Okay, we have two major operating systems. One major operating system and one minor operating system. The minor operating system is the Mac. The major operating system is Windows. I want to talk about how superior Windows is to Mac and what the major differences are. With Mac, it's basically a Linux port. With Windows, it's 100% proprietary. Now, to understand Mac OSX, you must understand Linux. And to understand Linux, you must understand Unix. Linux comes from Minix, which was an acronym for Mini Unix. Developed in the late 80s, early 90s. Then a European guy, can't remember his name, Trivoli, I think his name was, took Minix and ported it for x86 microarchitecture, which means the PC CPUs. Now, where Unix comes from, it comes from Bell Labs. Back in the 1960s, they used it for the digital switching, the switching boards. Instead of having those old school movies where you see a lady taking wires and plugging, receiving phone calls and connecting calls with a mechanical or physical switchboard, they called it. They started moving into mechanical switches, but the mechanical switches were controlled with a computer. The computer that controlled the mechanical switches was Unix. Now, not only did it control the mechanical switches, the very first hard drives ran on Unix. So it's a telecom operating system. Even the original Windows, the segment of code that was used to control hard drives came from thousands of lines of Unix. Now, up in through the 80s, Unix was still Unix. The 70s, Unix improved, obviously improved again in the 80s because the mechanical switches that were controlled by the Unix systems now became digital switches. In the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, an operating system from Unix called Minix, which means Mini Unix, was developed to run on PCs. They took that and they ported it for the x86 architecture and they called it Linux, which was large Minix, is where the name comes from. And there you have it, Linux. Now, Linux is generally seen as open source like Android and Red Hat. And when you pay for these things, you pay for support. That's the general idea. However, Macintosh computers or Apple computers paid for Berkeley Unix in some version of open source Linux. But they paid for the licensing so they don't have to share the source code. And that way they can also call it OSX. And they develop on these open source Linux and they ported it for their Macintosh computers. Now, the Macintosh computers, most of the porting was done because in 2003 they switched to an x86 CPU from the old Motorola Alpha chips, or what did they call them? Power PCs. The Power PC chips made by Motorola, but it was designed by IBM. Horrible architecture. Horrible computers back then. You couldn't do anything with them. You couldn't even play games. I mean, there was some games available on Macs, not really. And moreover, there wasn't even really good GPUs you could get for Macs, just because the operating system was atrocious. Some of the legacy code inside the Power PC version of Mac OSX was from 1986, 1984. It was just horrible code and on a really bad architecture. For what they were trying to do with that architecture, that's what made it really bad. That architecture was mainly Power PC, which was built for Unix. So all their coding had to be done custom, and so they reused as much code as they could. I know you have your Mac fanboys out there, and, oh, they've always loved Macs and this sort of thing. I haven't, because anyone who likes Mac OSX is not technical. These are for people that don't like computers, they don't really like technology, they'll get a Mac. That's really what it's for. And especially in the 90s, you really had to, because they were such garbage, you really had to be dedicated to Mac, to own a Mac. They were expensive, you couldn't do much with them. So they changed the architecture in 2003. They commissioned Intel for their Pentium 3 technology. It was actually a mobile chip for their desktops. And that's when Mac OSX was also introduced to run on the x86 architecture. But essentially, it's not really great technology. It's very old technology. Same with Linux. Linux and Unix are old technology. They're very old operating systems. They come from the 1960s telecom. And so they didn't do much with it. They haven't done much with it since the 1960s. They've improved it, and that's just code building. They've built up code on top of code on top of code. So essentially what Mac OS X is a Linux port. Not much different from Android. The only difference is that the OS X port you can't get the source code for. For Android, which is open source, you can get the source code for because Google chose not to pay for the source code. With OS X, you can't get the source code. It's proprietary. They paid Berkeley Unix and some Linux company for their source code, and that's what they built OS X on. It's essentially just a Linux port with a facelift, obviously, a different GUI. That's why you can't do much with them. I don't like this operating system. I think it's old school. Now, compared to Windows, Windows is a completely different technology. Windows runs on a central database called the registry. It also has a lot of code built into it to optimize for games and for media applications. Okay, they call it DirectX. If you're building a program, say for Windows, there's a lot less coding involved because you can just port the DirectX code from Windows over to whatever you're doing, whether it's a game or anything like that. Also, it runs on a central database, which makes it far superior to Linux. That's the major difference between a Linux system and a Windows system. It runs on a central database. Therefore, the coders, when they code, they just tell the program what they want at the beginning and what they want at the end. And then when it compiles, that's how it works. However, with the Linux guys and a lot of programmers, I met a lot of programmers that really love Linux. However, they like Linux because they don't have to pay for the licensing fee. There is a lot of licensing fees attached to Microsoft operating system. They don't like to pay that, that's fine. But the trade-off is support. So with Linux, if you're going to say run a company on a Linux system and run a company on a Windows system, with Windows you're going to pay for the licensing up front. With Linux, you need a very skilled engineer to run those systems. So what you save in licensing, you're going to end up paying over time in engineers. You're actually going to pay more in engineering for a Linux system than you are in Windows. Now, Mac OS X isn't like that because they give all the support because they charge you for the Linux port, essentially. So you get that support. However, you can't do very much with Mac OS X. It's not very great. They don't like making drivers for it. They support it, but you can't do much with it unless they code for that architecture directly. It's expensive, more expensive than Windows. The hardware that it runs on is more expensive than Windows hardware. We call it Mac tax. Mac tax is 80 to 100%. What that means, if you take the same exact hardware priced out in a Mac system and you compare it to hardware priced out in a Windows system, just the hardware alone will cost you twice as much because it's on a Mac and it has a Mac symbol on it, and that's what Mac officially uses and supports. On Windows, if you're a technician, you can build a desktop or even a server, and then you pay for the Microsoft license after. It's still cheaper than Mac OS X by a long shot, even paying for the Microsoft Windows licensing by a long shot. Much cheaper, runs better. Superior architecture, obviously, because even Mac recognized that and switched over to the PC architecture from the PowerPC garbage they were running before. So they switched the architecture, they never switched the OS. The OS in Windows is far superior to Linux. And even the Windows servers have Linux built into it. If you want to use all your Linux guy and you're using Windows, you can open up a terminal and you can implement all the Linux code inside Windows now. Now, with Windows, we mainly are just talking about the desktop because Mac OS X is just desktop. There's no enterprise iteration of OS X. Now with Windows, that's completely different. Even with and one thing I don't like about Windows is their marketing. They market, 3 or 4 different versions of a home OS. I always buy, from work, I'll get an enterprise version, obviously, for my computers, but also, if you're at home, I'll also get the professional version only. The other versions, they strip them down, the price might be lower and this sort of thing, but they do strip the OS of certain features, which I don't like. That's a marketing thing that started around 2003, 2004 with XP. Before that, it was just, you got your Windows desktop operating system, and that was it. When Active Directory came in, they started marketing it differently, different versions. I think they just need one version of desktop, and that would be ideal. Now, also, Windows has good server software. People don't realize this. They have enterprise server, they have regular server, they have SQL server. Okay, so this is not just for the desktop or home user. Windows is also capable of running servers. So if you think of Windows Server, it has your desktop interface. There's no DirectX because you're not going to play video games on a server, but they can even use that code to run entire servers. And like I said, these big servers, they might be expensive and everything, but if you're a Linux guy, you can still use the Windows servers. You can also use command line to do everything, if that's how you want to do it. With Windows, there's 3 or 4 different ways to do the same thing. You can use command line, you can use the GUI, any way you want. Even programs or program setting. All program settings can be controlled in the registry, believe it or not. You don't have to use that application. You can change settings on that application or in Windows in the registry. If you're not familiar with how to do that, don't do it. But you should play with your registry. Mind you, way back, 20 years ago when Windows first came out and I first started using it, I have messed with the registry in such a way that I had to reload Windows. So be careful when you're messing with the registry. It's the database that controls Windows. It also controls every application on that computer. It also controls the hardware. So you can even make hardware changes to your OS in your registry. It controls everything. That's what makes it superior to Linux. Linux is just an old operating system designed back in the 60s. It's only been improved with code on top of code on top of code over the years. Hasn't changed much. Windows, on the other hand, is a newer design, a superior design. The only thing that really holds it back in performance is the GUI. And the GUI comes, the graphical user interface, it comes from the registry. They say, but when you load Linux on a desktop PC, Linux will run faster than Windows. True, but Windows has a nice graphical user interface. And also, with Linux, you can't do as much with it as you can with Windows. However, in the future, what I'd like to see, and I have read a few articles on it in the past, is they will take segments of the registry, or even the entire registry, and they will burn them right into the CPU. They'll write them into the CPU. In that way, Linux will have no performance gains over Windows when they start doing that. At some point, they will do that. Right now, Linux, I just see, I just see it as, a really old operating system that's still really, hanging on to life somehow. Where you see a lot of Linux, believe it or not, it's in OSX. It's just a Linux port, guys. That's all it is. Also, where you see Linux is in Android. So we use it for phones. We use it for these crappy Mac PCs. That's where Linux is, just like CPUs. The old RISC-based architecture, that's what Linux was originally and Unix was originally designed to run on, was this old architecture. The architecture has changed, the OS hasn't changed. So, where do we see Linux? We see Linux the same place we see RISC-based processors. We see them on phones. We see them on tablets. That's where you get Linux ports. For that use, I think it's ideal. You have Android, which is excellent. Even iOS, the way it runs and everything, it's excellent. There has been some issues, obviously, with Apple slowing down people's phones on purpose. I believe they're being sued over that. So that's kind of weaselly, something I really don't like about that company. Another thing I don't like about that company is their operating system. OSX, sorry, it's just Linux. It's old school technology, nothing special about it. I'm sure they have a nice GUI and everything that people like to use and make it easy for people to use, but it won't do anywhere near as much as you can with a PC. Basically, a PC will run anything. It can run anything, even in an emulation. Okay, you can get emulators for PCs and this sort of thing. You can run anything. With Mac OSX, not so easy. You can't run any hardware on a Mac OSX either. With Windows, basically you can run any hardware you want. The latest GPU, the latest, if you want an off-board network card or off-board sound, you can easily do that with Windows. Buy the card, download the driver, everyone codes for Windows. Most computers out there are Windows. They're Windows because Windows is a superior operating system. It's superior on enterprise, in my opinion. It's also definitely, with no regard for anything else, is definitely the superior desktop PC operating system. Enterprise, people can push back and we can have a conversation about that, but definitely for desktops, Windows rules the roost for a reason. It's a newer design, it's a better design, it's more modern. We're in Linux and OS X and these sort of things. You can see that they're mainly popular on phones and tablets now. That's what they're for. If you want to run a Linux on your desktop, good luck with all that, because by the time you're able to run that the way you want and the way you run Windows, you'll be an engineer by then. So you might as well just be a Linux engineer if you want to do that. Okay, that's it for now. I'm Johnny O for The Gig. Subscriptions down below, arguments down below, questions, comments. I'll get to your questions, I'll get to your comments if I like them. If I don't, forget it. I'll just ignore you.